When we look at this era, the real contemporary of Sandow was, of course, George Hackenschmidt. Probably the strongest man was Louis Cyr from Canada.
Louis Apollon-Henry is a massive icon in sport in France.
In Sandwina's case, we have people's remembrances about how she struck them.
He empowered people to look after their bodies, get fit, improve their mind, and change their lives, and that's a great gift.
I think all of these strength legends have this desire to express themselves physically, presenting their muscularity and their strength in creative ways.
The fact that they were not just competing on a standard barbell meant that they had to find ways to demonstrate strength that the public could identify with, and that at the same time they could marvel at.
He was very modern in his exploitation of lighting. He had a posing box in order to show himself off.
Now we're all trying to invent new kinds of movement activities, but we have such a fantastic, rich history where we can draw from that can inspire us in harmonic proportions.
The first strong woman that I was ever aware of was Kathi Sandwina. And I've always wondered what happened to her. Her story is emblematic of a lot of the people who worked in vaudeville in that era, who at the end of their lives maybe don't have quite the luck that we want them to. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't still honor them. Maybe we should even honor them more because of what they were able to achieve despite all those odds.
I want to show you my greatest Sandwina item, and that's this large photograph right here of the Lady Hercules, Kathi Sandwina. And this one is signed by Sandwina down at the bottom. She's so graceful there in her motions, her movements, they're balletic. She's kind of presenting herself in this hourglass figure of hers in her high-heeled shoes, saying, here is my family, here are my children, here is my husband, and I am 100% all woman. So, I may be strong, but here I am. I'm beautiful.
When we talk about people as legends, we have mythic legends from the distant past. Babe Ruth is clearly a legend in baseball. And in our own field, in strength, whether it's weightlifting, powerlifting, bodybuilding, as we go forward, we discover that there are people whose stories transcend their time, and people want to remember them because there was something so physically unique about them. I think in Sandwina's case, although Minerva and other strong women who worked before her, they aren't remembered in the same way that she was, and they didn't have the kind of international impact that she had in terms of opening up people's ideas to what was possible.
Kathi was normally advertised as the strongest and most beautiful woman on earth. And you can see from contemporary newspaper accounts how really beautiful and fetching she was, although really big, but her skin tone and her hair and her demeanor quite ladylike in her behavior.
Female strength performers were always kind of seen as out of the ordinary, as freakish. They were sold to the public as just being strength athletes, but usually they threw a little sex appeal in there. Like Sandwina, have the strength of Hercules, but the beauty of Venus.
Most of the stories that you read about Kathi Sandwina say that she was born in the back of a circus wagon outside of Vienna, Austria. That, however, is not true. She was born into a circus family. Her father's last name, by the way, was Brumbach, and so she was actually born as Kathi, which they would have said as Katie or Kathi. So her real name is Kathi Brumbach. She was actually born in Essen, Germany. She was born on May 6th in 1884, so sort of at the very end of the Victorian era. And both her parents were very large, strong people. Her mother had also done a turn in the circus doing acrobatics and sort of strength-related work, but her father was reportedly 6'6" and weighed perhaps as much as 260 pounds or so, so a very, very large man.
This is the father of Kate Sandwina. This is Philip Brumbacher. And so he looks pretty strong to me too. It's kind of a neat picture.
So these were her parents. They were circus people. Not first generation either. They were several generations back, circus people.
Ja, also das ist das Wohnzimmer dieses Zirkuswagens mit den eingebauten Schränken. Das war also schon sehr modern. Man ist ja über die Straßen geholpert, das war ja nicht so glatt wie heute. Und da musste alles gut verstaut werden. Also mein Name ist Gerhard Mette. Ich bin Leiter der Sektion der Zirkusfreunde Deutschlands hier in Magdeburg und außerdem Leiter des Zirkusmuseums Magdeburg. Und hier hinten befand sich dann die Schlafstube oder Schlafstätte. Nicht? Alles sehr eng, sehr beengt, ist klar. Und dort im vorderen Bereich war die kleine Küche. Ja, dieser Wagen ist eigentlich für eine Familie ausgelegt. Also 2 Erwachsene, manchmal sogar 2 Kinder. Die haben dann auf dem Sofa geschlafen. Ja, also das war alles sehr beengt, aber es musste gehen.
It would be a hard, hard life. And most of the people who did it didn't last very long. They were broken down by the constant travel, the kind of gypsy life that they had to lead. Almost all of the old strongmen from that era died broken down. And so that's what Sandwina had to contend with as a young person.
When she was young, all accounts are is that she very quickly was stronger than the boys her age and stronger than young men her age. And the more she trained, the stronger she got. She was naturally very well put together. She had a very proportionate body. Her shoulders were broad, her breasts were large. She had a big rib cage. Her waist was relative to the size of her chest and the size of her hips, the size of her thighs. She was on the grand scale and weighed somewhere usually between 195 and 210 pounds and grew to be at least 5'10".
There was a collector, Fritz Dillenberg. All these photographs and collection and material. And he was the one who founded the first Circus Museum in Berlin. Mein Name ist Stefanie Thalheim und ich arbeite seit einem Jahr im Stadtmuseum in Berlin in der Sammlung Circus und Varieté.
Kathi Sandwina was born in Essen, Germany. Her father and mother were Philip and Joanna Brumbach, and they had a Brumbach family circus, as I understand it. She is the most recognized, most famous woman who's ever been a professional strongwoman. And so I have been doing research on her for a long time because she was known not just for being so very strong, which she was, but also for being feminine and beautiful. And so many people think that because of her, women found the idea of doing exercise and maybe even thinking about having more strength acceptable. So she's kind of a role model, a pioneer.
That one that is like a dumbbell photo. That's probably the only one that I have that's like me lifting, that's up in the house. That was like from my first nationals. I think that dumbbell was like 90 pounds. And it was like a PR. My name is Leifa Ingalls. I'm a professional strongwoman and a strength coach. I live in Orange County, California. Yeah, I never played any sports, like growing up. So I was like, okay, I need to learn how to use my body. So I started lifting a little bit and like, just working out in college, but I had seen strongman stuff before, and obviously I'd seen weightlifting, but it was always the weird stuff that I was attracted to that, so I was like, oh, that's cool. Those people lift barbells or those bodybuilders lift weights, but I'm like, this guy's carrying a tree around. Like, that's cool. And so I was on YouTube looking up some videos of some women doing Atlas stone in competition. And I was like, what? I didn't know this was a thing. So that moment was the moment that I was like, okay, I want to be a strong woman. And I just never stopped after that point.
A new world record so far, 3 attempts.
So the story that introduced me to Kathi Sandwina was at her size, she would actually, pick her husband up and press him overhead. And besides the fact that that's just cool, trying to maximize overhead press is one of the things that I'm constantly trying to work on and having this conversation of like, what's really possible? Can a woman do a body weight or above dumbbell press? Because of what she did, that kind of set a marker that that was possible.
So at the very beginning of my whole involvement with weights and strength, which began in 1973, in a gym in Austin, Texas, where Terry took me for a workout. And I had never met any woman at that time who lifted weights. And I wasn't really sure if I wanted to lift weights. I was just kind of there because he was my guy and we were hanging out together and having a good time. But I met a young woman there who had been competing on a men's powerlifting team, which was really early for that. And she was doing some deadlifts that day, and that was intriguing to me. And so I started did some with her, found that sort of more fun than the light stuff I was doing. And on the way home in the car, started talking to Terry about, women who trained and why didn't more women train and all of that. And Terry very quickly, used his sort of incredible encyclopedic knowledge to sort of say, well, actually, there were a lot of women who trained with weights at the turn of the 20th century, but most of them were circus performers or vaudeville performers or people who used their strength to make a living. In fact, the first name out of his mouth was the name of Kathi Sandwina, who was by far the most famous of all the early performers that we've had for women in strength. And we went back to his parents' house where he had a bunch of stuff stored from when he wrote his dissertation, found a copy of the Guinness record book there, looked it up, and there she was, right there in the record book. Some people say that the name of their circus was the Sandwina Circus, and that she therefore took the name from the circus. Other people say that when she began appearing on stage, that she actually chose the name Sandwina as an homage to Sandow. And probably there is some reason to think that that might have made sense. She always wore her hair up, like puffed up on her top of her head to make herself look taller. And she always wore shoes with little heels, which also made her look a little taller. Because she wanted to look big and strong. She embraced that, which I think is one of the things I like about her. When she first begins appearing in the United States, there are references to her between 1900 and 1910, and in those, she's actually performing with an act called the Sandwinas. They performed in Europe. There's a great poster of her holding up 3 men on a bicycle. They were not, though, the big stars of those acts. I mean, they're way down in the bill. They're like little tiny notices of the Sandwinas performing. She has probably more posters that have survived than almost anybody I know. And that's why this is interesting to me, because now I have a date for 25 on this. So it helps me to figure out this. And I'm pretty sure this is when she had come back to Europe, because if you were a German artist working in the circuses and music halls in America after World War I, not so good.
One time, he come up on the stage. I pick him up, throw him down. Then he say, I love you. Will you marry me? So we get married. lucky for him. All my life, I have to keep young and strong. With a wife like Mama's, you have to keep young and strong. Maybe only strong.
Max Heyman, her husband, was already an acrobat. Not a famous performer, but he was, like Katie, also German and of Jewish extraction. In his youngest prime years, he was about 5'6" and weighed at the most about 160 pounds. She, in her prime, weighed about 210 pounds. Some reports have her as heavy as 220. When they married, then the juxtaposition in their sizes made it interesting to people. And so a lot of the act that she did really involved lifting him when she was later working with the circuses.
Well, this picture is famous. It's the one of Kate and her husband, where she's putting her arm on his shoulder, probably consoling him because he's not nearly as strong as she is, but he seems to be taking it pretty well. I wrote a book called Venus with Biceps, and it's basically a pictorial history of women's strength. There's a beauty in strength, and there's a beauty in being able to express yourself as who you are. And Sandwina, if she emphasized that part of her character and that part of her appearance, then instead of people turning away in horror, they would actually start to respect her.
She was someone who practiced the standard events done by strong men. It's mentioned that she was able to raise over her head from the floor a barbell weighing 286 pounds. This is 130 kilos, a lot of weight. They did not have these revolving barbells. They were solid bells, stiff and very hard to lift. So when you lifted one, you had to turn the handle. As you turned the handle, the bells had to turn or the wheels had to turn. So she had to be strong enough in her wrists, in arms and shoulders, and put 286 pounds above her head. A good 60, 70, 80 pounds more than she weighed. That's just remarkable.
What I have here is a picture of Kathi Sandwina doing her circus act where she's carrying two guys on a stick there. This is from the Ringling collection, and it's from about 1911. We know that she is actually lifting those people because it's kind of blurry, and we know that it was moving around, so she's not faking it. She is actually lifting two guys.
And some of the talent scouts, they watch everything. And they see a woman who's so huge but yet majestic, walks very powerfully and looks athletic. It was her calling card. It was the thing that separated her.
But her real break came in Paris, where she was playing at one of the theaters there. And that night, John Ringling came and sat in the audience to watch them perform. One of the things about the circus was that the circus kind of presented people with an idea of things that they might not have ever thought about as being humanly possible before. To see a woman coming out of the Victorian era who was feminine and therefore still kind of within the bounds of social acceptance, but who was markedly stronger than her husband, than most of the men around her. This was a game changer. She was hired and she debuted at the Barnum Bailey Circus in New York City. And so naturally, the New York journalists began looking at her and thinking, this is really unique and different, and asking questions. And so the circus management decided that they wanted to single her out. They saw that she had star potential. And they talked her into changing the name of the act. And so at that point, it became Kathi Sandwina and Troupe.
She was a headliner at this point, so she was in the center ring. And that is what, she knew that she had arrived at that point when she was She was the main attraction. And that's when they start doing posters of her, and she starts getting all of this attention.
So this came to us, as many of our collections do, as a donation from a relative, in this case, Sandwina's widower, her husband, whose name was Max. So I'm Doug Reside. I am the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Curator for the Billy Rose Theater Division at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts. So in 1952, right after she died, her husband reached out to us, the first curator of the division, George Friedley, and said that he had this material from his wife and would like to give it to the library so that it would be kept safe for the future. And now, over 60 years later, we are able to look at it again. So we have a scrapbook that includes a lot of clippings from her career. So she was clearly an international star, and so there are a lot of clippings from German and Scandinavian newspapers that were collected. I think the posters are always exciting to me. They really give you a sense of what the show was and how it was marketed to audiences. It certainly tells part of the story of vaudeville, which is an important part of theater history. It's also interesting to show that she doesn't appear to be portrayed as a freak in the way that a strong weightlifting woman might have been seen that way, but she doesn't seem to be marketed in that way from this poster. She's described as the Wonder Woman, which also seems, again, like they're still recognizing her femininity. They're not erasing that in the way that some of the advertisements for similar kinds of acts might have. She clearly is an interesting individual that I think has a story to tell that I would love to know more about.
She is this really strong woman, and she performs these feats that verify that fact. But she's always sold as womanly, ladylike, almost dainty. You'll never see a picture of Sandwina flexing her biceps. She always wanted to be seen as this very feminine creature who just had extraordinary strength. And of course, the press loved that. They ate it up.
There was a woman who worked in the early 20th century who was a journalist who was kind of like an early 20th century Barbara Walters. Kate Carew was her name. She's quite well known. She only interviewed really important big shots. So she had interviewed Mark Twain. She had interviewed Teddy Roosevelt. And she did a big full-page article on Sandwina. But the other thing that she did, which was quite wonderful, was she did caricatures. And so she did these great illustrations of Katie and of what it was like to be around her. And so there's this like wonderful little cartoon that she did showing her sort of having to deal with what she calls stage door Johnnies. Because even though she was married, had this, baby, and she's all this, she became this sort of beauty icon in very real ways that allowed her to transcend a lot of the sort of concerns that other people might have about women lifting weights. So Sandwina's star took off.
She was physically large. She was a much bigger than average sized woman. And she came from a family of people that were also large and strong. So she also grew up in an environment where strength was not necessarily an oddity, but even with that, it still would have taken a lot of persistence and a lot of passion, not only to gain the physical abilities that she had, but to perfect the skill. She probably wanted to not only show off her ability, but just to inspire that moment of awe.
In the 20s, as she continues working, and of course by this time, think about she's into her 40s now, she's begun not to do as much of the overhead lifting and supporting work as she used to do. And what she's now specializing on is something in which apparently she was always gifted, which is grip and hand strength. But what she really becomes sort of identified then with is bending iron. And so she would bend iron bars into horseshoes. She begins advertising herself, in fact, as the Iron Queen. So When they start calling her the Iron Queen, that's a direct reference to Sigmund Breitbart, who at that time, one of the most successful strongmen working in Europe. And Breitbart billed himself as the Iron King. And there was a rivalry between them. So a lot of people sort of report that, they really hated each other. I'm actually not sure that that's true, because when she was 14, she and Breitbart supposedly appeared together when she was still very young.
The kind of strength that she had, often if you really have a big measure of it given to you by nature, and you nurture it just to a degree, and you pay some attention to it, it's going to stay with you for a long time. She was very strong when she was well up into her 50s and 60s. Her son, Teddy, Theodore Roosevelt Sandwina, he became a first-rate boxer and was actually the heavyweight champion of Europe. A big man, weighed over 200 pounds.
Here's a great picture of Ted boxing, and you can see the Star of David on his trunks. But Ted's the one that we remember because he really was, apparently, a very talented boxer.
There's a wonderful photograph of her holding him over her head with one hand. No tricks, and it seemed to have been casually done. So this goes along with being strong early and being strong late.
The Depression, of course, was really hard on all of the strength performers because most of the vaudeville theaters began to close. That enormous industry was killed by, the lack of money for entertainment, but also killed by the movies. And so people would much rather go watch a moving picture than they would a bunch of performers on a stage. So in the 30s, Kathi worked some off and on in what was called the WPA Circus. So the federal government here in the States funded what was called the Works Progress Administration, which built bridges and playgrounds and did all kinds of public works. They helped also fund artists. And so for here and there, they also did some circus performances in the 30s, which she participated in. But clearly things were playing out. She was on into her 50s, although she was still quite strong. And so at a certain point, she and Max decided they needed another line of income. And so they bought a bar and restaurant in Queens. They called it the Circus Bar, which is kind of great. But apparently it was a place where you could go in and get a meal. There were obviously drinks there. And then sometimes on the weekends, she would perform. She would do, for example, the Bed of Nails act, where you lay on a bed of nails and then she would put a block on her thing and then people would pound on it with sledgehammers. And that was, of course, dramatic and exciting, but not really very hard if you can tighten your abdominals. Max did the cooking at the restaurant and Kathi tended the bar. She was also supposedly the bouncer.
All our customers be nice and quiet. You got respect for us. What do you have?
I'll have a beer, please.
You see, boys, when I got a little bit too rough and tough on the bar, you know what I'm doing? I call Mama. She take care of everybody. That's enough here. Come on.
And there were a number of newspaper articles published about them at that time, sort of showing her in the bar and she would sort of pick up some small guy and throw him outside if there was trouble.
She always did it very nicely, and she would always ask her husband, Papa, please open the door. And he would open the door and she would toss them out.
We have there on Staten Island in more recent years. This is something relatively new on Staten Island. They swim across from New Jersey. They avoid the bridge and the toll by swimming. My name is Shmuel Plafker, and I'm the chaplain here at the cemetery. Great Sandwina was buried in 1952. I wasn't working here in 1952, but I would imagine that funds were an issue. For many people, not having enough money to go to a funeral home is a major, major issue. And therefore, we were the organization, the family, was able to turn to and say, we need assistance. She was of the Jewish religion, she passed away, we cannot afford to go to a funeral home, we need help. And that's where we step into the picture.
It was inspiring to me as somebody who had never trained before to think about what she had done. I didn't really aspire to break her records, which were mostly overhead lifts, of course, but it was the notion of her. And also, as I learned more about her, how she was perceived, because she was really regarded as very different in that she sort of had this ability to be perceived as a feminine, attractive, beautiful woman, and at the same time, she could do feats of strength that no men could do. And she was really prodigiously strong. And it's actually very, very sad to think that at the end of her life, after that long, illustrious career, that there was not enough money for her to have been taken care of as we might have imagined the great stars of the circus would have been. We were asked recently, if we were going to make a statue that would sort of celebrate female strength, what kind of a woman physically would be sort of the great embodiment? There was no question that for me and for Terry, it was like, oh, it has to be Kathi Sandwina. And so Michael Deming is working on a statue. And I thought that one of the things that he really did so well was sort of to capture her body, the sweep of her hamstring, the calves, the sort of small joints that she has. And I think the statue is going to just be fantastic and iconic. Like the Louis Cyr statue has become, like the Sandow statue. The Sandow statue has been given at years at the Olympia, at the bodybuilding contest. The Louis Cyr statue is what we give every year at the Arnold Strongman Classic. And I think now to receive the Sandwina, that's going to be very meaningful. That's going to be a treasure that I think people will really appreciate.
She's heavy. She's heavier than I remember. God, weight her. So 2017 was the first ever professional strongwoman championship at the Arnold, and choosing the Kathi Sandwina as the symbol, not just for the trophy because it looks cool, but for the event itself. Because the symbolism of here's something that seems like it shouldn't be possible or that the general public has kind of dismissed as not being possible, but it turns out we can do it. It was a really big honor to be a piece of that.
Sandwina, she has become one of the legends of strength because she combined that physical ability with a showmanship that many other athletes were lacking. She's called the Herculean Venus of her day. She combined beauty and strength. And that's what a lot of people remember about her and what still inspires them.
My opinion is Kathi Sandwina will always reign as the sort of queen of the early days, the pioneer days of strength athletics. In her case, she went through 2 world wars, lots of dislocations, but she's going to be remembered for the things she did and the gifts that she had, how she husbanded those gifts and added to them with her efforts. She was indeed one of life's true wonders.
When I think about Kathi Sandwina and I think about the people in our field that we regard as legends, it seems to me that of all the strong women, she is clearly the most significant woman figure from the past. And her multiple achievements in the circus, demonstrating her strength over this long, long period of years, makes her, I think, a figure who really does reserve our respect and our admiration. And I also think she's kind of a great role model for us. Scholars talk often about what they call a paradigm shift, which is where you have this sort of dominant way of thinking and then gradually over time, everybody comes to believe something else. And I think that with women in strength, we're almost getting there to where that's fully in place.